Well, good day, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for being here. Today, we're having our webinar specifically on the role of the brain economy in strengthening democracy. We're choosing to take a hopeful perspective that the brain economy can strengthen democracy. Because there are significant concerns about the strength of democracy, and we do need new tools and strategies to strengthen it. And so we do hope that this brain-based economic transition can provide us some novel insights and ideas. But let's unpack it today through the interplay of brains and democracy, which we know is bidirectional, which we can unpack a little bit further. This webinar is held in the context of EMEA, the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, and also the Global Brain Economy Initiative. We have some wonderful data that was shared with us before this session from one of our colleagues who couldn't make it, 𝗠cie𝗱𝗿𝗁𝗁, which essentially allows us to, even before this webinar, to update the 2022 Brookings paper that we developed looking at the role of brain approaches to strengthening democracy. 𝗠cie𝗱𝗿𝗁𝗁 shared a number of papers that he's published recently in either Nature Medicine or Nature subjournals that demonstrate that democracy challenges are associated with accelerated aging, are associated with brain changes when you look at very, very large data sets of over 50,000 up to over 150,000 subjects across the world. So we know that democracy is absolutely influencing our brains, ultimately, as the data is suggesting, for the negative, and we'll provide more data about these studies further. But of course, our brains are the seat of our thinking, feeling, and motivation and actions. And so our brains determine democracy engagement, how much we engage, how we deal with information, potentially mis or disinformation, etc. And so anyway, this just starts to help us to unpack these dynamics. But the structure of the webinar today is that we have a number of initial keynotes to have interventions to put a bunch of data and expertise on the table, and that will be followed up by various discussions and discussants where we will synthesize a lot of the information that's being put out. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite Rim Ayadi, who's the founder and president of EMEA and a founding advisor to the Global Brain Economy Initiative, to present to us the latest data on the Global Brain Capital Index as a way of starting, as we build up the data and insights today. Let's start with the Brain Capital Index. So over to you, Rim. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to all here from Barcelona, and thank you very much, Harris, for the introduction. And I'm happy to share the work that we have been doing with Harris and other Brain Capital Index. Today, my speech would be concentrated on brain capital and governance. So, in fact, this topic is no longer theoretical. It is really structural for our collective future. And I think we can clearly see that we live in a world shaped by geopolitical fragmentation, economic shocks, also climate risks and technological acceleration, and, as you mentioned, demographic transitions. And all of this, we could see around the world, a erosion of democratic values. In such a context, we must ask ourselves what really determines the resilience and prosperity of nations. I can tell you one answer clear for us is we all believe about institutional quality, which is underpinning democratic institutions, but also institutional quality is particularly in a participative democratic system, does not come without brain capital and a healthy brain. So this is also extremely important. Next slide. So you can see here, and I'll go fast, within the work that we have been doing on the brain capital measurement overall. So the definition is key. So what is brain capital? Of course, is the integration of three core dimensions, mainly the two core concepts, brain health and brain skills, and within the brain-enabling ecosystem. It goes beyond traditional human capital that we all know very well. And in fact, the human capital measures the education and labor productivity in a system, in an economic system. So we go a bit beyond. Brain capital measures the quality, the resilience, the adaptability, creativity, sustainability, and overall neurocognitive capacities across societies in a healthy brain. So in fact, to operationalize this, we developed the Brain Capital Dashboard since many years now with the help of many partners, and also we launched the index. We launched the index a month actually in January, and this is all available, freely accessible on Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association website. So this is not a concept anymore. This is really, I would say, measured, and it's becoming also a governance policy tool. So next slide, please. So as you could see here, the index rests on the 3 pillars, which are completely close to the definition that I mentioned. The pillar 1 is brain health, which include the mental and neurological well-being across populations globally. And then the brain skills, which are cognitive, socio-emotional, creative, and digital competences that we try to measure over time, subjected to the availability of data. And then the brain enablers is really the infrastructure to enhance our brain capital, which are, I would say, the prerequisites in terms of health, education system, digital infrastructure, and environmental factors. And these are all interact with each other really to build our brain capital infrastructure. So it is a systemic framework, and also because without brain health and skills, without brain health, skills cannot flourish. And of course, without enabling environment, neither brain health nor skills can flourish. So I think without these dimensions, we cannot improve as a nation. And in fact, all of these dimensions are interacting with each other to enhance our innovation capabilities and also to enhance our overall prosperity as nations, be it in the developed countries, but also in the emerging markets, and also in low and middle income countries. Next slide, please. So let me walk you through the core finding. Next slide. So brain capital is critical, but has been overlooked driver of economic performance. Countries with strong brain ecosystems should demonstrate higher innovation, productivity, and resilience. Yet we see clearly that in macroeconomic theory, it does not integrate brain health or cognitive capability. So this is really what I call the blind point within our economic theories. Next slide. So global brain capital has become more vulnerable since 2010, of course, after the financial crisis, and it is clearly that vulnerabilities have increased due to, as I mentioned, recurrent crises, financial, economic, and pandemics, which have raised the mental health pressures, education disruptions, digital overstimulation, and also social fragmentation and climate anxiety. So these are all stressors which have been really impeding us to get into overall potential of brain capital. So in fact, the strain on cognitive infrastructure and brain infrastructure is growing. Next slide. So we see that brain capital remains highly unequal, but convergence is possible, in fact. So inequality persists across region and all income groups, as you can see in this slide. However, governance reforms, institutional quality, and targeted investment can foster convergence. So if a country really has I would say, an intentional policy to develop the infrastructure for brain capital, then, the convergence is possible. So in fact, brain capital is not written in textbooks, but then it is really policy driven. It's a policy choice that depends on institutional quality and good governance. Next slide. OECD countries outperform overall, of course, because they have invested heavily on enabling environment factors, but the brain health gaps are also misleading. Sometimes we can see that OECD countries perform strongly on skills and enablers, but then brain health pressures are often very significant. This also shows the reporting on the high burden of brain diseases. This is interesting to know, but sometimes we see a picture that is a bit gloomier than, for example, countries that do not report. So, but again, I still believe that high income does not guarantee cognitive well-being. So even if countries have a high income, they still need to have an intentional policy to ensure that to guarantee overall cognitive well-being. Slide 8, next. So we see the brain enablers. They are highly sensitive to economic shocks during crisis, for example, education budget shrink. Of course, there are less fiscal space, innovation also and investment slow down, and overall the health system, including mental health system, are overstretched, and we've seen it. So in fact, plus, during crisis, there is consolidation of short-term fiscal policy, which often undermines long-term cognitive capacity and overall health. So this is clearly a governance paradox that we need to solve. Next. Now, as I mentioned before, brain health it's under global strain based on the data that we've seen, and as emphasized previously, that mental health challenges are rising. Because of aging population, because of the rising anxiety, depression, burnout, and more neurodegenerative diseases and non-communicable diseases risks that are really adding on to system vulnerabilities. And these are, in fact, and I repeat, underestimated globally, particularly in the emerging markets and in countries that do not have the capacities to report this type of variables. But then when it will become well captured, this variable will become a very key macroeconomic variable that can be used much widely. Next slide. So the good news is brain skills are improving, but again, we would like to see more data to measure, for example, the digital competencies, much more targeted, and also as I mentioned, the neurocognitive skills that they are not yet measured in all countries, like, for example, the power of creativity, adaptability, critical and ethical reasoning, and also socioeconomic intelligence. In fact, they are not well captured yet, and this is why we need to have more data in that space. But then at the same time, we see that there has been an increase of digital competencies, but then we have to be aware and very careful that we need to also look at the downside of artificial intelligence and loss of attention to delegating, the attention to online platforms and etc. So in fact, the measurement gap within this pillar is, in fact, a big influencer of the policy blind spot that we still see. Next slide. So income alone does not determine brain capital, and this is very clear. So some middle-income countries demonstrate remarkable resilience due, for example, on social cohesion, institutional trust in some countries, and cultural emphasis on education, for example. Governance and institutional quality often outweighs income level. So what is important is to have governance and institutional quality that are targeted into an approach which is intentional, that puts mental health and brain skills in the center of policy construction. Next slide. So countries that maintain strong institutions, social protection system, adaptive governance framework, and good quality institutional framework protect brain capital during shocks. And in fact, systemic resilience determines long-term performance, economic performance overall. So next slide. The visual here really reinforces a critical shift. So of course, brain capital index measures healthy cognitive capabilities, which in fact we cannot, without which we cannot guarantee a quality of our institutions and governance. And this really goes beyond GDP, which in fact tells us about what we produced yesterday. But brain capital, in fact, tells us whether we will remain innovative, stable, adaptive, and also it is a forward-looking mechanism. So Next slide. Also, we are going beyond human capital index or human capital framework because, in fact, this within an artificial intelligence-driven economy, comparative advantage will increasingly depend on cognitive flexibility, creativity, ethical reasoning, long life learning, and mental resilience. So all of these depend very much on neurocognitive skills in a healthy brain. So this is really a structural transformation. Next slide. So what we are discussing today is key because brain capital is institutionally anchored. And I repeat twice, it is institutionally anchored. Brain capital is not about individual or nation overall intelligence, but really it depends on the interaction between education, healthcare, labor market structure, governance framework, and social protection. So if we look at the slides, the next slides, please, Demi, we see clearly a positive correlation between, for example, political stability and brain capital. The next slide, rule of law and government effectiveness. So again, it is anchored within good quality institutions, and it is decisive. So in reality, what does governance require? It requires embedding brain capital into our policies, fiscal, education, public health, finance, and also innovation strategies. It also requires us to protect our cognitive investment during crisis, and these are all should be embedded at institutional level, and it will help us really move brain capital into an upward trend, and this is what we would like to see. So in reality, also, brain capital can become a compass to assess quality of institution. So thank you very much, Harris.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rim. That's a great overview of brain capital, the dynamics going on globally. And then some of that new data that you shared at the end there is for the first time ever is, definitely tying the brain economy to democracy. So I appreciate that. And it's a great first start. Without further ado, I would like to invite Alexander Hudson to make his remarks. Alexander is Senior Advisor to the Democracy Assessment Unit at International IDEA. So Alexander is a democracy specialist. We've been engaging, Alexander, with yourself and your colleagues over the last few years, and hopefully you can see the brain economy work has been maturing slowly but surely, including we had a major report with the World Economic Forum in January. But Alexander, welcome your remarks and thoughts. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Harris, and thank you to the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association for the invitation to be part of this webinar and present some of our work. And congratulations on the publication of the Global Brain Capital Index. It's a tremendous resource. The report, the dashboard looks really interesting, and I look forward to exploring it more. I'm going to present quickly, and I should start a little timer for myself so I don't go too long here. Our 2025 Global State of Democracy report. So this is an annual flagship report for International IDEA. And you'll note that the data go up to the end of 2024, and what I can present for you today. We're working on the 2025 data, but that'll take another couple of months to finish. But really, a lot of the data look at longer-term historical trends. And so the picture will change a little bit when we have the 2025 data, but not too much. So the presentation has two parts. First, global trends in democracy, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about migration and democracy. And I think there's going to be an interesting connection there. Hopefully we can make it between sort of the democracy data and the brain capital data, and how when people are moving, it kind of complicates our analysis. So whenever we talk about trends in democracy or the quality of democracy, of course, we have to begin with what is democracy? What does it mean? As I'm sure you've heard, it's a essentially contested concept. So for International IDEA, just to be clear, we understand democracy as having two defining characteristics or principles. And these are popular control of decision-making and decision makers and equality between citizens in the exercise of that control. So that definition doesn't say anything about elections, about nation states, just about the fact that people have control over government and policies that affect them. Then when we go to measure democracy, we don't measure the sort of central concept here, democracy. We measure its component parts, chiefly representation, rights, participation, and the rule of law. And we do this by aggregating a lot of data. So we take 154 indicators covering 173 countries from 22 different source data sets, and then estimate a value per country year for each of those concepts of democracy. So the first high-level takeaway will not surprise you. Democracy is more often declining than improving in the world today. Countries with at least one decline far outnumber those with advances. So if we just look at the end of 2024, more than half of the 173 countries that we cover were experiencing a decline in at least one of those factors of democracy on the previous slide, while 32% were advancing. And we note that the declines have been concentrated in those categories of representation, rights, and the rule of law. And you could note in particular at the top of this graph, where we have the sort of area representing the number of countries that are experiencing advances or declines. For each of these factors, no change is the most common state. So most of the time, most countries are not experiencing a statistically significant change in their performance in any of these factors. But with one exception, the number of countries with declines far outnumbers those with advances. And you could note at the top of the graph, access to justice, credible elections, effective parliament, civil liberties, and judicial independence as key areas where there are many countries experiencing declines. The only place where we find more advances than declines is absence of corruption. There are some nuances to that that I'm not going to take a lot of time to go into right now, but the key finding here is that most of the time there are more declines than advances. Turning to two important factors of representation first, we're showing here the change over the last 5 years in the number of countries experiencing advances or declines. And you can see that for credible elections, 35 countries were experiencing a decline in 2024, sometimes called the global elections super cycle. More people voted that year than ever before in human history. And 35 countries experienced a decline in their quality of the elections. 32 countries declining in effective parliament. Turning to rights, the most common decline was in freedom of the press, closely followed, in fact, by freedom of expression. And I think that's important to highlight, as those are part of the social context that enables brain capital. So these are important things for us to keep in mind today. And you can see that the number of countries declining in freedom of the press is rapidly increasing over the last 20 years now, with 43 countries declining in 2024, covering a broad spectrum of levels of performance. So it's not only countries that were already at a low level getting worse, but also high-performing countries experiencing a decline. Turning to rule of law, we can see the trend is quite similar, with significant numbers of countries declining in judicial independence, predictable enforcement, and personal integrity and security. And participation. So there's less change in factors of participation than in other sort of categories of performance. But I would note the civic engagement graph is kind of an interesting flip, where 20 years ago, 11 countries were improving and one was declining. Now we have 12 declining and one improving. And so the trend is decidedly negative. And just to summarize all that information in just one image, we could say each country could be on balance across these different things that we measure, either improving or declining. So there's some number of countries each year in one category or the other. And every year since 2016, more countries have been declining than advancing. And this is kind of an interesting echo, perhaps, of what we saw in Professor Ayadi's presentation as well, kind of contemporaneous challenges, I would say, for brain capital and for democracy around the time of the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Something appears to have shifted. Maybe it got worse during the pandemic, but the trends are decidedly negative. And I'm just going to go very quickly here because this isn't the main focus of our discussion today, but usually in the second part of the Global State of Democracy report, we take a focus on a particular issue. And in 2025, we looked at democracy on the move. So the extent to which people who have migrated can still participate in democracy. And I think this is important to think about also for brain capital, in the sense that it is a property of individuals who happen to reside in a particular country. And so our country level measures are somewhat complicated by large numbers of people moving across borders. And so they bring their experiences, their education, etc., with them, and have some impact in the places where they go and also the places they have left. So just quickly, comparing 1970 and 2024, the total number of people who are living outside of the country of their birth has tripled. There's great diversity in the methods of out-of-country voting. So in some places, it is impossible to vote from abroad. A lot of the time, you need to go to a diplomatic mission. This is the in-person voting or other official place in a country abroad in which to vote. Sometimes there's postal voting, multiple methods. There's no sort of convergence globally in how out-of-country voting should be practiced. We found that registered voters abroad participate at lower rates than registered voters who still live in their country of birth. And I want to just highlight this for a second, because again, we're talking about resilience and a nice synergy with the brain capital approach. And so the literature shows us that voting can contribute to a sense of inclusion, and through that, a diffusion of support for democratic norms. And then as we think about the bigger trends in democracy, this contributes to active participation or resistance against authoritarianism, and in that way to democratic resilience. There are some political dimensions here. I'm going to have to basically skip over this, but it's not always the case on the partisan motivation side that out-of-country voting is extended for good reasons. Sometimes there are self-interested reasons for it. It also raises a lot of questions about legitimacy and territorial matters. But I would invite you, if you wish to dig deeper into some of the things I've barely touched upon here, there's a QR code on this slide where you can access the full report. But here are some of the points that we wanted to sort of take home or think about further, that migration continues to grow. And so these questions about inclusion, belonging, the quality of democracy, the experiences people bring with them and kind of send back home are going to be increasingly important questions. So thanks very much for the opportunity to share this, and I look forward to the rest of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Fascinating data and great compliment to the data that Rim shared with us. I take your point about contemporaneous crises that we have with democracy and also with brain capital. And so that is sobering and then also focuses the minds of all of us on this call and folks listening to us. We have contemporaneous crises that we need to think through solutions. And so in that regard, the next speaker is a practitioner, scholar, advocate, Kate Woodsum. And so Kate, I welcome you to the floor. You're the founder of the Invisible Threads Impact Lab, which you can explain a little bit more, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. You've experienced some of this firsthand in a very serious way, and now you're dedicated yourself to solutioning and advocacy and storytelling. And so I welcome you to the floor to reflect on all of what you've learned and heard so far this morning and other things that you've been preparing. Thank you, Kate.
Perfect. Thank you to everybody, and hello from Costa Rica. I'm here for a brief break from covering the democratic decline in my home country, which is the United States. But vacation couldn't keep me away from you guys. So thank you for having this conversation. It's healing in its own way. I live in Washington, D.C., where despair has become an ambient mood. attacks on democratic norms, erosion of civil liberties, political violence, collapsing trust, our so-called beacon on the hill feels dim. And yet, as everyone is looking for here, I feel hopeful. Because what I have come to understand is that the democratic crisis is not just political, it's biological, and biology can heal. I know this personally from covering one of the darkest days of American history, and I'm going to take you back to that day. It was January 6, 2021. I want to do this to take the theoretical and make it personal. On January 6, 2021, I was a journalist for the Washington Post, burned out after a year of pandemic coverage, racial justice protests, and a volatile election. That morning, I was exhausted and I wanted to go back to bed, but instead I pulled on a bulletproof vest and I headed toward the White House. What should have been a ceremonial certification of votes became a violent breach of the US Capitol. I dodged tear gas and flashbang grenades, and when members of the mob realized that I was the press, I was swarmed, surrounded, called vermin, traitor, enemy of the people. My nervous system did what it had learned to do long before that day. It had learned from covering hostile environments around the world, and it had learned from growing up in an unsafe home. My nervous system deployed to assess, to adapt, and to survive. I wanted to run, I wanted to lash out, but instead I listened and nodded to members of the mob. And when there was a brief space, I asked a question: what upsets you most? They said that the election was stolen, that the media was corrupt and covering it up, and that journalists were fueling division. I disagreed with their claims of fraud. There was no evidence for mass fraud of the scale they were talking about. But I couldn't dismiss something deeper. Our media ecosystem, our economic and political systems, they all run on attention. Attention is captured by threat. Threat activates the nervous system. In that moment, I wasn't just standing inside of a riot. I was standing inside a feedback loop of chronic activation, political, economic, informational. My nervous system was on high alert. Their nervous systems were on high alert. And we were all carrying the wounds and wisdom of a country, of communities, of families, forged by our own rupture and repair. After January 6th, I developed complex PTSD. Flashbacks from the Capitol fused with violence from my childhood, and I saw danger everywhere. I had panic attacks. I began to question whether life was worth living if I couldn't keep performing at the pace my profession demanded. So I turned my reporting toward my own healing and toward trauma science. So let me share some of the science that many of you already know, but it never hurts to get a refresh. Every nervous system is designed to detect safety and danger. Our nervous systems are working to keep us alive. And when stress is acute and we can recover, we grow more resilient. But when stress is overwhelming or prolonged, when people lack safety, dignity, voice, or agency, the nervous system gets overwhelmed, flooded. It can't process or metabolize the stress. The brain's alarm system becomes hyperactive. The pathways to reasoning weakens. Ambiguity feels like threat, and difference feels like danger. When the nervous system is overwhelmed and can't recover, can't metabolize the level of stress because it's too much, too fast, too soon, or too long, this is a wound called trauma. Globally, most people will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime. Add economic precarity, racial injustice, information warfare, climate anxiety, we are living in prolonged activation. Now, scale that from the individual to a nation, to the system. History shows what happens next. After World War I, Germany's humiliation and economic collapse created conditions that Adolf Hitler exploited. In Cambodia, where I began my career, trauma from genocide shaped political control from decades. And that genocide followed a war incited by the United States. In Hungary, Viktor Orban capitalized on fear to dismantle democratic institutions. This pattern is human. When populations feel unsafe and unheard, authoritarianism promises certainty. Strongmen promise protection, right? Simplistic narratives promise relief, and the authoritarians, the strongmen or women, tell you who to be afraid of, so it's easier. Traumatized societies fracture into camps that experience one another as threats rather than neighbors. Anyone else stressed? Okay, so here's where the hope comes in. We can heal from trauma. Our brains are flexible. We have neuroplasticity. We can rewire. And when people experience genuine safety, dignity, belonging, and agency, physiology shifts, curiosity returns, and perspective widens. Collaboration becomes possible. These are the ingredients of a healthy democracy. As I saw possibilities of healing within my own self, I began to see them on a societal level. And I knew I couldn't stay in a newsroom that kept the reporters and the public we served in a chronic state of fight, flight, freeze, and appeasement. That is why, despite winning the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service with my team at the Washington Post, I left traditional journalism. The science and possibility of healing are why I began collaborating with neuroscientists and trauma experts and systems thinkers, in part convened by Georgetown University. And that's why I founded the Invisible Threads Impact Lab. Our mission is to reveal these invisible threads between mental health and democracy, or what this crew calls brain health, or brain capital and democracy, and to build resilience at individual, institutional, and systemic levels. So we do this through 3 strategies. The first is what I call regenerative journalism, designed to leave the civic soil healthier than we found it. This weaves nervous system literacy together with media literacy. It's reporting that informs without inflaming, and it contextualizes threat and complex problems rather than amplifying them. The ideal is that regenerative journalism leaves people more grounded than destabilized. As you gain this awareness of what's happening inside and around you, that creates a demand for agency. That's the resilience skills we teach. Practical neuroscience-based tools that help people recognize when they're in survival mode, when they're reactive rather than responding, so that they can pause, regulate, and respond rather than act in a way kind of like I did at the US Capitol on January 6th. Democracy requires citizens who can tolerate ambiguity, sit with the discomfort, manage stress, and stay in relationships across difference. We're having a really hard time with that. So as you build the awareness and gain the agency, then we start to see, okay, this doesn't just have to do with me. My stress isn't intrinsic alone. It is from a wider world that is creating harm, right? We're caught in not being able to say what we wanted to say next. And we're also caught in the patterns of reactivity. So the third part is systemic transformation. And this is what everyone here is talking about. We work with institutions to identify where harm is cycling, where burnout, polarization, or distrust are being reproduced in order to redesign environments to support long-term well-being. Because healthy political systems require healthy nervous systems, and healthy nervous systems require economic, informational, and civic conditions that cultivate safety and agency. 5 years after January 6th, many democracies are facing a choice. We can continue escalating, louder rhetoric, faster outrage, deeper fragmentation, or we can address the roots. We can recognize that what looks like purely political dysfunction is also unresolved stress and trauma playing out at scale. It doesn't excuse the harm, but it explains why punishment or retribution or policy reform alone will not fix this problem. If we want resilient democracies, we must invest in resilient humans. We must invest in the tools, environments, and narratives that support healing. The science is clear, the historical pattern is clear, and I believe the path forward is clear. So the question isn't whether we can afford to do this work. The question is whether we can afford not to. Back to you, Harris.
Right. Well, Kate, that's very profound. Thank you so much for sharing your personal story and your journey and how you're seeing these big issues and then your own situation and then pushing it into change at different levels with different levers that you're pulling. So very grateful to have you here, and thank you again for sharing. And I'm sure everyone was quite touched by what you shared. Now, in the spirit of also another practitioner of sort of driving change and implementing change in the democracy space, I'd like to welcome Facundo Manes from, I believe he's coming in from Argentina, from Buenos Aires. Facundo, welcome. Thank you for being here. Facundo is a neurologist and neuroscientist. He's a professor at a number of universities in Argentina. The one we have listed here is Favaloro University, but Facundo has a few different hats that he wears in the business and civil society world and nonprofit world. Facundo, we welcome your remarks, particularly based on your recent engagement in the political sphere in Argentina. Facundo, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Harris, and congratulations for all the work that you are doing. It's really impressive. As Harris said, my name is Facundo Manes. I am a neuroscientist, and I am also a politician. For more than 30 years, I study the brain. I study memory, decision-making, emotion, human behavior. I believe I understood the brain, but then I entered politics and everything changed because politics is not only about power, it is about human brain. And what I discovered was something profound. Democracy lives in people, and people live in brains. Democracy depends on brain functions. Functions like reasoning, emotional regulation, empathy, social trust. And all these brain functions are very fragile. Stress changes the brain. Fear changes the brain. Poverty changes the brain. Inequality changes the brain. When people live in fear, they cannot imagine the future. They focus on survival. The democracy requires future thinking. And this is biology, no ideology. Today, we are living in what many of you call the brain economy war. An economy where the most important resources is the human brain. Brain capital, brain health plus brain skills, is becoming, thanks to your work, the main driver of prosperity, innovation, and democracy. Countries that protect brain health will lead the future. Countries that don't will fall behind. This is not theoretical. In Argentina, in my country, we are making some progress in brain legislations. We are progressing in a bill, in a brain health bill. We approve it in the parliament, and we now need the approval of this brain health bill in the Senate, because it is a social challenge, an economic challenge, and a human challenge. Science now shows that up to 40% of dementia cases could be prevented. This means that brain health is a public policy. Entering politics, let me tell you something personal. Entering politics was the most vulnerable decision of my life. Because in science, evidence protects you. But in politics, nothing protects you. But I learned something. If people like us, who believe in evidence, leave public office, evidence lives with us. And democracy becomes fragile. Memory is not just a record of the past. It is a platform in which we build the future. Because the future of democracy depends on the future of the brain. To conclude, for many years, we believed that democracy depended on institutions, free elections, independent courts, constitutions. But today, neuroscience is showing us something deeper. Democracy also depends on brain capital, on the cognitive and emotional capacity of the citizen, on their ability to think critically, to regulate emotions, trust others, and imagine a common future. Because democracy requires citizens who can deliberate, not only react, who can cooperate, not only polarize, who can tolerate uncertainty, not only seek simplistic answers. In my country, in Argentina, I have seen how economic instability, how social fragmentation and institutional distrust affect not only political outcomes, but also emotional regulations, attention, hope. Democratic fragility is also a cognitive fragility. And today, this challenge is amplified by the new force, the digital environment. Today, we live in a digital environment shaped by immediacy, emotional stimulation, and constant interruption. This new environment rewards reaction over reasoning, certainty over complexity. And this is not only a communication problem, is a neurobiological problem, because digital environments shape our brains and also shape our behavior. And this is why brain economy is so important, because brain health is democratic infrastructure. Societies that protect brain health, that invest in brain economy, will have stronger democracies. We are entering in a century defined by artificial intelligence, cognitive overload, and rapid change. And in this world, the ultimate advantage will be brain capital. As a neurologist, as a neuroscientist, I believe we must protect the brain foundations of democracy, because the future of democracy depends on the brain. Thank you so much.
Yes, we want to clap a round of applause, Facundo. Thank you very much for those profound points, because as you described, you're synthesizing this from many decades of neuroscience experience, but now extensive experience in politics and in the arena. And so the way that you think these things through and observe and develop plans for the future is extremely unique. You're perhaps singular as a politician and scholar. So thank you so much, and we look forward to continuing this journey of developing the brain economy with you. You've been involved in it from the start, and so it's great to have you here today to help us to think this through from a democracy perspective. So anyway, thank you very much, Facundo.
Thank you, Harris.
Now I would like to welcome our last keynote speaker before we get into discussion, 𝗍cie𝗍𝗍, who is coming to us from UNDP. 𝗍cie leads the mental health and psychological support services at UNDP. And 𝗍cie, thank you for being here, and thank you for giving us our last intervention. And hopefully you've got plenty of food for thought based on the first speakers, the data and the personal stories and the practice. So over to you, 𝗍cie.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really inspired by, amazing contribution, Facundo, colleagues, Kate, and all of you, and Professor Reem and Harris for inviting and creating these spaces. Really, I don't know how to actually tackle, because I was just observing and listening so deeply, and I was really touched. It's a subject that really matters to UNDP, because we are looking really how to tackle poverty, how to tackle democratic governance, or what does that mean actually to move countries through the development plans that they have, through the sustainable development goals that the world has set for themselves. So listening to this conversation for me, it's another reaffirmation. That's why we really need to talk about the brain economy, brain health, brain skills more often. So basically, what I want to bring to the discussion is, what does that mean? All this data and the discussion we are talking about, looking at the decline on a democracy, as our colleagues from IDI mentioned, and also at the same time, sort of improvement in the brain skills, paradox, AI, and the climate and other challenges we see. But how we are actually looking into the brain economy as it's taking place in a framework around the world, that we see more countries going through crisis, fragility is increasing. There are a number of the countries that we have in the list of fragility is increasing. So what does that mean? And that's where I want to share with you a bit more. So just to introduce UNDP, we are an organization with almost 5 billion based on our 2024 budget. And 60% of this budget goes to the fragile context. That's where the most request comes from the government for support. And 1 in 5 people in those settings has a mental health conditions. Epigenetic research on Syrian refugee families shown trauma marks in grandchildren who never experienced the violence directly. So you can see even the people who have never seen that through the intergenerational trauma carry that forward. And roughly half of countries emerging from conflict slide back to conflict. So think of it as 2 parallel moving forward. That psychological wounds go unaddressed. We can't believe, really, we can't build a brain capital for democratic resilience while 2.1 billion people live in contexts where it is being systematically dismantled. Can we? Something for us to think through. The Lagos findings confirm that at the neural level, adverse sociopolitical environment accelerate biological aging in the very brain network responsible for social cognition and emotion regulations. Conflict does not just break institutions, it breaks the biological machinery of democratic participation, the inclusion that Fukando was speaking about. But we have evidence that this damage is reversible. For example, in Nigeria, our Counseling on Wheels program achieved a 44.6% reduction in vulnerability to violent extremism. And that was peer-reviewed. So although it's a project level, but it still is a credible information for us. Cognitive flexibility replacing rigid threat perception. That is a brain capital rebuild, Harris, that we are talking about. That's how we are actually looking into that. In Rwanda, integrated psychosocial support and peace building, this is part of the, again, a project level, 80% improved in forgiveness, 40% decrease in extreme poverty. And through one of the funding structure that exists across the UN and really dedicated in 2025, quite a lot of funding in support of countries to really bring the mental health and psychosocial support as part of whatever we do, as acknowledgement that's why it's so important to really take into account brain capital and brain skill. Actually, through their own evaluation, they find the most transformative innovation overall and foundational to peace, where we actually take into account brain skill and brain development, cognitive regulations, and all the work that in my field we encapsulate as mental health and psychosocial support. What does this mean really for the brain economy agenda going forward? From my view, at this stage, 3 things. Give the brain economy a fragility lens. The work that has been done through great work, Harris, you have really spearheaded really a great work around the brain economy. And, the data, the 26 trillion in unrealized brain capital. The greatest returns are in countries on the cusp, like Colombia, Nigeria, Iraq, where targeted investment is the nudge that moves a country from fragility towards development. Every dollar invested in treating depression, anxiety, returns 4 to 15. And this is from the scientific version. We haven't really developed a measurement to really look into much more the brain skills as we are speaking. Treat brain capital as democratic infrastructure. That's what we have been talking today. Population carrying unprocessed collective trauma shall reduce trust, lower participation, heighten threat perception. These are not health outcomes. They are democratic deficit. And UNDP's strategic plan framed these under effective governance for exactly this reason. And the three measure it. The Global Brain Capital Index is a strong start. Great work, really. Congratulations to years of insight and the work has gone to that. But why does the Human Development Index, or most established measure of national progress, still not capture mental health, social cohesion, or institutional trust? How we are going to actually, we are getting close to 2030. How we are actually planning with the new framework there will be another way of measuring our progress toward development to really place the brain economy for the decades to come. And the work starts from yesterday, that we really need to collectively think of the measurement so the whole world be able to measure it as part of the new development framework that we will establish. And I hope so. So the products I began with has a resolution. So I just want to bring us to the closer. Democracy is not declining because people are less intelligent. It's declining because the relational brain capital that holds societies together, trust, cohesion, the willingness to participate is being eroded faster than it's being rebuilt. A phrase guides our work: settled mind, settled lives. Healing the conflict within us helps resolve the conflict around us, but also the importance in our relationship as it's important to us with the people and with the environment, because I want to make sure that we are taking into account the whole impact of the climate in this ecosystem. UNDP is committed to ensuring the brain economy reaches the place where brain capital is most at risk. Thank you so much.
Nika, that was a brilliant overview of the context of crisis and fragile situations in the world. Some of the wonderful data points for hope of different types of therapies and actions that could be taken, and so grateful to have you with your implementation, your large-scale implementation lens and position here with us today to help us to think through solutioning for individuals, for communities, and for larger nation states as well. So it's extremely important that you're here, and thank you for your input and for closing out the keynote pieces. I think folks will agree that we've gone with our keynotes from very advanced new data and insights through personal perspectives and actions, and then closing with large-scale implementation with you, Nika. So thank you. Next, we're moving into the discussion component, where I would like to welcome 𝗠cie𝗱𝗿𝗁𝗁 to be with us to give some reflections. 𝗠cie𝗱𝗿𝗁 is a neuroscientist and professor of economics based in Italy at the University of Pescara. I apologize if I mispronounced that, but 𝗠cie𝗱𝗿𝗁𝗁, we welcome your synthesis of what you've heard so far, and then after you, I will introduce the rest of our discussants. But 𝗠cie𝗱𝗁𝗁, over to you.
Thank you very much, Haris. It's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation, so illuminating in so many different respects. Well, in the short time that I have, I would like to propose a way to encapsulate some of the issues that have come out from a perspective that maybe could sound initially a bit, unexpected, but I think will quickly converge into a possible interesting framework in this regard. It's very important to stress the fact that democracy has always entailed very severe cognitive challenges. And to make an example in this regard, I would like to quickly step back over the 5th century before Christ in Athens. So the situation in which democracy was born, which is completely different from the one we are living in today, but gives us pretty interesting lessons. First of all, imagine what is, from the brain economy point of view, the biggest possible challenge if you create a new polity like democracy in a place in which all previous history was about dictatorship. The problem is that lawmaking becomes a cognitive activity at a level that was unprecedented. For this very simple reason, if you have a dictator, the dictator has a divine mandate. He can make whatever, and I say he because, as we know, it would be difficult to have a female dictator at the time, at least in the West. He would actually decide what he wanted and could say, okay, it's the divine mandate. God wants this. So if you are objecting to this, I kill you, nothing personal, but you've broken the law. What happens if you create a democratic polity? You create a situation in which all of a sudden you have to decide which kind of laws you could make. But which kind of laws means that you have to deploy an extremely challenging exercise in counterfactual reasoning. You cannot simply say, okay, this is the law today. You have to say, okay, what happens under any possible circumstance if I make a law with these characteristics? If I give vote to women, what happens if there is a famine? What happens if there is a war? What happens if? All this stuff is incredibly challenging from the point of view of brain metabolism. For the very simple reason that the brain, as we know, has a disproportionate energetic demand with respect to the body mass. It's basically 10 times as bigger than the actual share of the body mass. However, most of the functioning, the basal functioning of brain metabolism is related to the maintenance of functions that have nothing to do with cognition. They have to do with, of course, control breathing, control heartbeat, control immune response, whatever it is. So the small part that you really have the possibility to use for cognition must be under a very severe economic pressure from the metabolic point of view. This means that challenging ways of thinking are extremely costly for us. So you can only use them for a reason. But that was a case in which you really had a reason. Because how can you make laws in this particular case? Counterfactual reasoning is one of the most costly activities from the cognitive point of view because it requires the computation of so many different scenarios. How did the Greek resolve this problem at the time? You could never believe it, but they solved that with theater. Theater became literally a laboratory of counterfactual thinking. What happens if I kill my father and marry my mother? Literally, I have a chance to explore the craziest possible scenarios. But to be able, and by the way, there was a reason to do this, because the counterfactual reasoning for the Greek at the time was not like, what happens if event X happens? It was more like, if I do this, how about Jupiter? Will he be happy or not? How about Juno? I mean, will they fight for us or not? So, it was literally deciphering the personality of supernatural beings in contexts that were literally stories. So this was completely, I would say, tailored to that specific circumstance. But what is the necessity in this case? The necessity is that in order to be able to appreciate and to follow a story, people have to develop specific cognitive skills. These cognitive skills require attention, and they require focus. And this attention and focus must be very prolonged. If you have the theater festival in Greece, if you imagine how they look like, it was like hours-long shows in which several different comedies and tragedies were on stage. This really means that the capacity of people to focus should have been outstanding from the point of view of keeping the focus and the interest. As humans, by the way, we are tuned to react to stories. in a very radical way, I would say, biologically. Stories are one of the few experiences in which we stop drinking, eating, going to the bathroom, whatever, if the story is really absorbing, and we really want just to know how it goes on and eventually how it ends. However, this capacity to focus is really related to a human capacity to get trained to maintain attention stretches for a very long time. What is happening today? Today, we are seeing literally the inversion of this mechanism. We are in a situation in which, for a very long series of reasons, there is a competition for attention, and this is related to the development of the attention economy in the contemporary scenario that we are witnessing at the moment. But clearly, this competition has literally to do with betting on the fact that if I maximize the stimulus and I bet on the shrinking of the attention span, in some sense, I'm winning a competition. Because of course, as we said before, people tend to economize on mental resources. If you give them an alternative that is cheaper, they will accept it. Not because, or better, they will not accept it if they are trained not to. But being trained not to is not different from physical training. Of course, if you run 2 miles every day, you will not accept the fact of, let's say, slowing down, because in some sense your physiology is tailored to at least 2 miles of running every day. But if you're not running, or if you are occasionally running and you have an opportunity to go by car or to just bypass the physical effort, you will do it. So the problem is that what is happening today is that we are witnessing a contraction of what we could call the experience space of people, which means the level of complexity that they can handle with respect to the capacity to invest in the deciphering of the cognitive costs related to all possible kinds of experiences. So if I train myself, if I challenge myself with experiences that are in some sense going beyond my level of attention and focus on a certain moment, with time, this border expands, but my capacity to deal with more complex experiences widens. But however, unfortunately, if the opposite happens, if I am constantly substituting for cheaper alternatives from the cognitive point of view, my experience space shrinks dramatically. Democracy, as I explained in the case of Greece, needs a minimal threshold of cognitive engagement that is not negotiable. The problem is that when you drop below that level, literally there's not a possibility to have a functioning democracy, because a functioning democracy requires that people at least consider some amount of counterfactual thinking. Because otherwise it's like, okay, something happens, for example, let's say there is a crime, an immigrant, let's say, kills or does any kind of harm to someone else, and somebody steps up and say, okay, death penalty for everyone who makes a crime, commits a crime. And if you have no fluency in counterfactual thinking, you say, of course, because you're completely driven by the emotion of the moment. Democracy only works if people have enough capacity to reason counterfactually to say, no, this is very silly. This will never happen. And you immediately see how this resonates with the winning strategies of populist thinking today. Because populist thinking is doing exactly this. It's building on the fact that the attention space and the experience space of people shrinks, and they actively, in some sense, encourage this kind of tendency, because this creates a huge possibility for manipulation. So for us, the real challenge from a neurobiological point of view is to create sustainable ways to engage communities to maintain a certain level, a certain breadth, we would say, of an experience space. And interestingly, the case of theater shows that there can be very ingenious ways to do this. And these ingenious ways sometimes have to do with unconventional means. For example, things like theater that we tend to classify as entertainment could become extremely powerful strategies for behavioral change, for example, or for, let's say, behavioral sophistication. So when we think of the brain economy, we should also consider the fact that the brain, with its plasticity, offers us opportunities and strategies that are generally not necessarily under the radar already. Okay, so this was just a way to synthesize a few thoughts in a way that I think could be useful for future reflection. Thank you very much.
Yes, that's terrific, 𝗏𝗏𝗁𝗁. Very, very elegant way of pulling on the past and into where we are now, and then some ideas for the future, and the arts, culture, storytelling that captivate us. Are a glimmer of hope to build back people's attentional capability. So anyway, thank you, 𝗏𝗏𝗁𝗁. Very, 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 very well put, and gives us all lots to think about here as well. Okay, in the interest of time, we have 13 minutes left. I want to hand the microphone to 𝗏𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁, who's founder of Neurocentury and senior fellow with European Policy Center and the Center for Future Generations. 𝗏𝗁, where is your mind at with all of this at this stage?
So I have a couple of reflections about where we are, and also a couple of ideas what the brain economy framework can do to support democracy. So to start with where we are, Zygmunt Bauman, a British-Polish sociologist, wrote this book 21 years ago called Liquid Life. And his argument was that there is something structural in modernity that keeps on asking for constant change. And what this means is that we tend to be never satisfied with where we are at a given point in time. We want something different. So we think this is associated with the 2020s, but in fact, it's actually rooted more deeply in how modernity emerged. There is also a cultural change to take into account, and it has to do with how we moved from oral to written, then to internet culture, and now to AI culture. This is fundamental for how we understand our relationship with democracy, because what these older cultures allowed us to do is to understand the world and nature in a much more direct fashion. And the brain was, in fact, reprogrammed for that, and now it's being reprogrammed again as internet and AI press on, removing the contemplative side of reading, which I think was very valuable. Now, there's also this sense of disorientation in our lives because they are less rooted in the physical world. They are both in the physical and in the virtual world. And politically, this was expressed, I think, most famously by Theresa May, the British Prime Minister at the time, who said, if you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. So I think many of us around the table would probably belong to that category. But the question is, how do we build collective action on the basis of such experiences? And finally, when it comes to the input of brain science to the study of democracy, I think it's very much about our sense of agency. And a scientist, a neuroscientist who studied and has studied this phenomenon most profoundly is 𝗏𝗏𝗁𝗏𝗏𝗏, who showed a few years ago that sense of agency actually results from a specific activity of the brain circuits, right? So it's not a transcendental feature of the human nature. It's something that we can observe. And therefore, what we do in democracy, in society, is a function of whether or not we compute correctly. And if we understand more and more about this sense of agency, that means also that people can aim to manipulate and try to change our subjective experience. And that is obviously what we are witnessing as we speak. Now, moving to the brain economy, I think there are 4 tenets worth spending a bit of time on. First of all, sense of agency and the need for active protection. Going back a few years, we have done a lot of work on the concept of neuroshields. So the NeuroShield takes into account these learnings from neuroscience in designing ways to protect our children and adolescents or our citizens more broadly as the impulses are becoming omnipresent. And policy is taking insights from that work. Last November, the European Commission presented a proposal of the European Democracy Shield, so using the same term, which was very much about the integrity of the information space, of course, obviously about the institutions, the free media, and so on, but also building resilience through engagement. And just a few weeks ago, NATO, that does consistent work on cognitive warfare, NATO's chief scientist prepared and published this report, which you can see here on the slide, on cognitive warfare. So in order to protect ourselves, we need to take that cognitive resilience very seriously. Now, a word about health. I think sense of agency in health is also becoming extremely important because we are moving from health understood through the prism of disease into health in which we take things into our own hands much more prominently. So that's the prevention and longevity paradigm. Thirdly, we have the human and the artificial intelligence. And here the sense of agency is about building complementarity, namely developing ways in which we can have AI and the human acting in conjunction, in companionship. And lastly, there is that sense of agency in the workplace. So the workplace is where we spend a lot of our lives, and we cannot afford to outsource our brain health and our cognitive welfare out of the workplace. It needs to be integrated. So that takes us to the concept of brain positive organization, which really puts all the insights that we have from neuroscience into how we design spaces, how we also run our agendas in the workplace, so as for them to be in line with the findings of neuroscience. And I will finish with a few words that you may not have expected, namely about a sense of purpose, because in this liquid moment that I described at the beginning, I think we need a renewed sense of purpose. And that takes us to the Aristotle directly, because he was the one who was almost obsessively writing about a sense of purpose. To him, this was the entire essence of being around, but also interestingly, the whole essence of social and political life. So without this, social and political life would not have a meaning. And in the 1920s in London, there was the Aristotelian Society, which really formed around this notion of activism. And it argued that the purpose of society is really how we solve the most pressing issues of our times. So for me, the brain economy is also on the quest for purpose. And that means verifying our assumptions, trying to understand better what is meaningful to us, refusing to accept that there is no alternative, as we would often hear, but also take action. I think a lot of what we do is increasingly action-oriented, and there is a deep meaning in it. Thank you so much.
Wow, Pawal, it was a wonderful set of reflections and new inputs as well into this. So brilliantly done. Appreciate it in particular that you're also linking us back to some current policy documents and multilateral documents so that we know that there is work being done in this area, particularly with NATO and the European Commission. But anyway, thank you, Pawal, for those many great points that you added. In the interest of time, I want to hand the microphone to Sonia Guerrero from UNESCO, it's a science of learning specialist. Sonia, you are lucky last of a very fascinating webinar. So I welcome your thoughts. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you, Harris. I will try. I know this ends in a few minutes, so I will try to be quick. Thank you so much for this invitation. I am very honored to be among this very distinguished panel of speakers. What I would like to argue and try to argue very quickly in the last couple of minutes, you've mentioned at the very beginning and throughout about how education is one of the factors or the enabling factors or the outcomes of the brain capital. And I wanted to bring in a stronger focus on this brain economy initiative of actual learning and development, which I think is missing in what we've been currently talking about. So to begin with, I think we are going towards the same ends. We both, I think both what we do in education and what you're doing in let's say in the field of economics or other fields, we are looking, we still are trying to think about future outcomes, how education and other aspects of life like access to healthcare and so on is for ensuring people have a better life outcome, access to social opportunities and economic labor market access. In education, and we currently we are phrasing, or the group is phrasing, brain capital for economic outcomes, economic prosperity. We do this in education as well, but we actually put a stronger emphasis on brain development for human flourishing. And this links a little bit to what a couple of speakers were saying recently, and the most recent one that brought in the Aristotle, from philosophical and ideological perspectives in the history of education. It's really been about human flourishing and developing humans for their full potential. This is what education what is supposed to be about. And I think with the introduction of mass education in recent years, it's been about contributing to the labor market, which is important for our overall well-being and ability to take advantage of society's offer. um, just the perspective is a bit switched, which is that instead of thinking of education or learning about the economy, the improvement of the economy, it's really about human flourishing and shaping people for their total fulfillment. And this is where the aspect of democracy comes in, because these are the types of understandings and learnings that have to do with those more of the social aspects of learning. And so this is what I wanted to bring in very quickly to very quickly sum up. I don't know how much more time I have left. If I can take a couple of more minutes,
Take a
Harris.
couple more minutes on you, sure.
Thank you. I wanted to bring in that what we can do with education is begin to shape the individuals for that society we want later on, a more democratic society, a more socially inclusive society. And it's not easy to do because our education and our educational infrastructures are created by our current teachers and other adults. And so we have to consider that they are part of the current system already. And so it's very hard to do this. But we think in education that if we agree with the brain economy, but if we really want to move towards more democratic societies, we should really come in early on. I think everybody acknowledges the importance of early brain development, but it's more than just early brain development. It's really what happens in the school, and it goes beyond learning to read and write and beyond building skills for the labor market. It is really about shaping the individuals we want these societies to have, in particular more democratic societies. And so, which is why in education we started to advocate for the inclusion of social emotional development in addition to the cognitive development. This is something that's very important to UNESCO. And from what we're doing with the science of learning at UNESCO, we also know that what we know about the brain can also help us shape more effective curricula and pedagogies and learning environments. And this is why we are working on this program called the Science of Learning. And what we've done to move this field forward, which in education does not seem like it is quite innovative still, because we are still working in silos, is to create what we're calling a global alliance on the science of learning, which is essentially a group of people that is that UNESCO convenes together to start to work on these global challenges. And what is important in this group of people is that we bring in the scientists, but not only. We want to break down the silos and bring in the educators, edtech developers, which we just heard most recently how technologies is reshaping our brains, and the policymakers. Because if we don't have policymakers in the room, anything that we learn or anything that we'd like to promote will not have an impact at a national level. So in conclusion, very quickly, what I would like to say is I think we're working on the same things from different perspectives. I think both are important. Labor market, economic, but also human flourishing and personal fulfillment, which we think is important for getting to those democratic ideals. And one of the colleagues earlier had mentioned that, the future of democracy depended on brain capital, and I really like that line. And I would say, actually, the future of democracy, I think, would depend on what we think our educational purposes are, because this is how we shape individuals. And if we don't consider that from the very beginning, and how we shape our education systems, our curricula, and and what we instill as important as children grow and develop, then I'm not so sure we're going to be getting to those democratic values at the end the way we're expecting. So with that being said, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I really do hope we could work closer together. I think we are going towards the same aims.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sonia. I agree. We're very aligned. And I think your point about democracy is significantly shaped by brain capital. It's a point well taken, and you're making it very clear that education is a key influencer. We've also talked today about institutions as influencers, the attention economy as an influencer, the role of storytelling, the role of arts, the role of culture, and the role of other forms of policy in driving us out of this contemporaneous crisis. So I'd just like to close it out with those remarks. Thank you, everyone. This has been fascinating and varied contributions that all have made. And so we will now work towards a synthesis of this and be sharing that publicly in the coming days and weeks. So thank you all very much, and we will be in touch and continue this conversation and this action plan moving forward. Thank you all.